The cold was not a simple condition of the air, it was a physical weight, a dense, invisible fluid that pressed against Elias's bones, leaching the last vestiges of warmth from his core. It had been weeks since the last true meal, the kind that left a protective film of satiety against the world's constant demands. Now there was only the hollow drum of his hunger, rhythmic and relentless, punctuated by the sharp, needle-like pain in his chest that came with shallow breathing. He walked the fringes of the scar, the old municipal dumping ground adjacent to the defunct rail yard. This was not a place of green growth or life, but a sprawling, scarred expanse of cracked concrete, pulverized brick dust, and tenacious, sickly brown weeds that clung to the thin, nutrient-poor soil. The late afternoon light was weak, filtering through a perpetual layer of industrial haze, turning the landscape an uncompromising, melancholic slate gray. Elias was searching for nothing specific, only relief. A dry crevice, a piece of heavy cardboard, something that offered even the slightest barrier between his exhausted body and the biting chill of the earth. His hands, perpetually grime-stained and chapped, traced the contours of the ground, moving mechanically, driven purely by the instinct of survival, honed sharp by sudden, terrifying abandonment. He stumbled near a shallow ridge, an area where the ground seemed to have settled unevenly over the decades. It was a subtle, topographical anomaly, a smooth, elongated depression running parallel to the rusted fence line, too neat, too straight to be natural subsidence. Most people would have ignored it, dismissing it as geological chance or the result of old machinery movement. But Elias's eyes had become specialists in overlooked detail, trained to spot the useful defect, the hidden anomaly. He knelt, the gravel digging instantly into his threadbare trousers. He felt the soil, damp and heavy, packed tightly by years of rain and winter frost. He pushed away a clump of matted weeds, exposing a patch of firmer, strangely resistant earth. Unlike the loose silt surrounding it, this patch felt dense, almost rigid, and held a subtle, echoing resistance beneath his probing fingertips. A faint, almost metallic smell permeated the cold air when he disturbed the surface, not the sharp tang of fresh rust, but the low, historical odor of deeply buried iron and aged petroleum, a scent utterly distinct from the decay of vegetation. Curiosity, a fleeting flicker of warmth in his otherwise cold psyche, spurred him to action. Elias scrabbled in the dirt, abandoning the cautious approach. He used a jagged piece of ceramic drain pipe he had tucked into his pocket. A makeshift shovel and weapon rolled into one. The rhythmic, scraping noise was gratingly loud in the oppressive silence of the scar. He dug vertically for perhaps 6 inches, the soil coming away in heavy, wet clumps. Then the pipe hit something solid. It was a flat, unyielding clunk, not the dull thud of a large rock, but the sharp, resonant tone of impacted metal. Elias froze, his breath catching painfully in his throat. His heart, already racing from the exertion and the gnawing hunger, began to hammer against his ribs with the frantic urgency of a trapped bird. He discarded the ceramic pipe and began scooping the remaining soil away with his bare, numb hands. The effort was immense, the muscles in his arms screaming in protest. He went slowly, deliberately, excavating the perimeter of the object. The cold air burned his lungs, but a strange, feverish heat had begun to spread across his face. The color, when it finally emerged from the brown grime, was an unmistakable faded olive drab. The paint was thick, chipped and scored, but preserved enough to confirm its identity as military surplus. As he cleared more dirt, the convex curve of a fender became apparent, followed by the faint, almost ghostly line of a window opening, long sealed shut by the compressed earth. He was digging into something far larger than a simple engine block. He was uncovering a vehicle, The sheer scale of the task nearly overwhelmed him, but the desperation for shelter, the tantalizing promise of an enclosed space, however small, overrode the exhaustion. He dug for what felt like hours, his focus narrowed solely to the effort of removal, the scraping, the pulling, the disposing of the heavy, freezing dirt. He eventually uncovered a small metallic rectangle set into the metal skin, a handle, or perhaps a latch mechanism, heavily oxidized and caked in decades of mud. It was stiff, fused almost completely into place. Elias tested it cautiously. It wouldn't budge. He searched frantically in the dirt until he found a sharp, flanged piece of rebar, a sturdy lever. He wedged the end of the rebar beneath the edge of the access panel, careful not to snap the brittle metal. He exerted all his remaining force, tightening his jaw until his teeth ached. His body trembled uncontrollably, not just from the cold now, but from the incredible strain. There was a profound, agonizing groan of protesting metal, a sound like a giant sighing after a long, silent sleep. The latch gave way with a jarring, sudden snap. He yanked the small, hinged access panel open. The resulting hole was perhaps 12 inches wide and 20 inches high. Too small for casual entry, but perhaps just large enough for a scrawny, desperate boy. A rush of air, stale, thick, and surprisingly warm, puffed out of the aperture. It carried with it that distinct historical odor, the metallic note of aged gasoline, the dry scent of canvas long unused, and an overriding chemical smell of antiseptic and formaldehyde. It was the scent of a forgotten wound. Elias hesitated for only a second, the fear of the unknown warring briefly with the crushing certainty of the cold outside. The cold won. He squeezed through the narrow opening head first. The rough, jagged edges of the metal scraped painfully against his jacket and the skin of his back, but he ignored the sting. He plunged into the darkness. He fell perhaps 3 feet, landing awkwardly on a soft, yielding surface that cushioned his impact. For a long moment he simply lay there, panting. The silence absolute, except for the frantic hammering inside his chest. He was inside. Slowly, carefully, Elias pushed himself up onto his knees. The darkness was total, thick and impenetrable. He raised his hand, testing the space above him, and felt the low, curved roof of the cabin pressing down. He fumbled in the pocket of his jacket until his fingers brushed against the smooth casing of the one precious luxury he possessed. A small, almost spent box of matches, salvaged from a broken gas station dispenser weeks prior. He struck one, the sulfur igniting with a brief, startling hiss. The tiny, sputtering flame revealed the space in a dizzying flash of detail. He was inside the service compartment of a massive, heavy-duty ambulance, likely dating to the Second World War era. The vehicle was resting at a severe angle, nose down, its tires long dissolved or separated from their rims. The walls were lined with pale, faded green paneling. Directly beneath him, where he had fallen, was a thick, dust-covered canvas stretcher, folded and strapped across 2 low, built-in benches that ran the length of the interior. The air was dry inside, astonishingly so, shielded from the surrounding damp earth by the thick metal shell. It was a perfect subterranean tomb of preserved history. Elias extinguished the match, the residual glow leaving phantom images on his retinas. He did not want to waste the meager source of light. He fumbled in the darkness for the entry point, reached out, and pulled the metal panel back into place, sealing himself in. The silence returned, intensified by the sense of being encased. He huddled, pulling his knees to his chest, trying to regulate his breathing and his terror. The temperature was perhaps 10 or 15 degrees warmer than the outside air, a monumental difference. The cold receded from its immediate burning intensity, replaced by a lingering, deep-seated ache. He rested for a long, necessary period, allowing the sheer physical reality of his safety to sink in. He was hidden. He was dry. He was temporarily warm. Once the immediate panic had subsided, the analytical side of his survival mechanism kicked in. Resources. What did this historical relic offer? He struck a second match. This time, he moved the small flame slowly, studying the interior. Near the front partition, next to a small, opaque window that looked into the driver's cab, a series of shelves and brackets were built into the wall. Most were empty, save for dust-caked outlines where objects had clearly rested for decades, but secured tightly to the wall, suspended just above head height from the floor level, was a box. It was rectangular, made of heavy dark wood reinforced with metal strapping, painted the same faded olive drab as the exterior. The closure was a thick brass clasp, tarnished dark green and black by time. It was the medical kit, the lifeblood of the ambulance. Elias felt a surge of energy, a potent mix of fear and desperate hope. Medical supplies often contained useful items, spirits, clean cloth, sometimes even old hard rations intended for shock victims. He stood up carefully, testing the angle of the floor. The vehicle shifted infinitesimally beneath his weight, eliciting another groan of aged metal. He reached up, his fingers grasping the smooth, cold wood. The clasp was not locked, but rusted shut. He used the flat end of the rebar piece he had brought inside, prying carefully at the joint. The brass resisted, then cracked with a high, snapping sound, releasing a puff of fine, pale dust. He pulled the lid open. The light of the match was already guttering, threatening to expire. He brought the tiny flame closer, shielding it with his cupped hand, letting the fragile light fall directly onto the contents of the box. The sight made him physically freeze, the match flame steadying unnaturally in his grip. The kit was astonishingly well preserved. Sealed tight against the oxygen and moisture, the materials inside looked as if they had been packed only yesterday. It was not the mere presence of the objects that seized him, but their pristine, terrifying sterility, the immediate overwhelming contrast between his own filthy, broken vulnerability and this meticulously organized repository of healing. The match went out, plunging him back into profound darkness, but the vision remained burned onto his retinas. He let out a ragged, uncontrolled gasp. He could feel the sudden, dramatic acceleration of his pulse, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Elias fumbled for another match, his hands suddenly unsteady, shaking so violently that the effort of striking the sulfur head was nearly impossible. The terror was not of ghosts or external threats, but of the objects themselves. Strike, hiss, light. He held the match higher, leaning close over the open box. The first section contained row upon row of packaged dressings, large flat packs of surgical cotton, snowy white beneath the thin, brittle plastic wrap. Rolls of compressed gauze, bound tightly by string, their weave fine and impossibly clean. He saw packets labeled simply, "Burn Dressing, Large." The sight of the sterile white textiles was the initial trigger. Elias looked down at his own hands, visible in the weak light, cracked, caked with mud, crisscrossed with cuts and grime that had long since festered into mild chronic infections. He saw the filth, the neglect, the profound uncleanliness of his existence, and contrasted it with the flawless, untouched purity of the supplies. The shaking began, as a subtle tremor deep in his diaphragm, then spread rapidly through his arms, making the match flicker precariously. It was a reaction born not of immediate physical pain, but of a deep psychological shock. The confrontation with the potential for care that he had been utterly denied. This kit was prepared for human suffering, equipped to deal with the brutal consequences of war, and yet here he was, suffering a slow, quiet, ignoble defeat by hunger and exposure, entirely overlooked. He moved the light to the next compartment. Here, the contents were more disturbing. Glass vials, stoppered tightly, arrayed in felt-lined slots, small, highly polished metal instruments. He identified a row of small, tightly coiled wire loops attached to a needle, sutures. Beside them, small glass ampules containing a viscous liquid, labeled in faded military stencil, likely antiseptics or localized pain relievers. Then he saw the instruments of invasion. A row of specialized tweezers, forceps, and a long, thin scalpel, its blade still gleaming faintly silver beneath the patina of time. These were tools designed to cut flesh, to probe deep into the body, to repair catastrophic damage. They spoke of violence, but also of meticulous, life-saving intervention. Elias's teeth began to chatter, the sound loud and ragged in the stillness of the ambulance. His entire body was now vibrating, a physical manifestation of his internal terror and awe. The realization was sharp and devastating. The war that had necessitated these items had been over for decades, yet the capacity for devastating injury and the capacity for precise, necessary healing remained preserved, terrifyingly potent. He focused on a specific, smaller compartment near the hinge. Tucked neatly inside were several metal tubes, stoppered with wax. He carefully picked one up. It felt cold, heavy, and significant. He managed to read the faded script on the tube, his eyes blurring slightly from the intensity of his emotional distress. Morphine sulfate, injectable, shock. The word shock resonated. Elias understood shock. He lived in a perpetual state of physical and emotional shock. The vial represented a cessation of pain, an immediate potent surrender to relief. But the context, the fact that this was a drug reserved for the most extreme, shattering physical trauma, magnified his own vulnerability tenfold. He dropped the tube back into its slot with a sharp clink, recoiling as if burned. The shaking intensified until his muscles ached with the effort of holding his frame steady. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was an internal earthquake. The sight of the medication, the perfect tools, the clean dressings, all designed to restore life and fight against overwhelming odds, forced him to confront the severity of his own plight. The fact that he had nothing, not even the simplest clean bandage, to combat the slow, festering decline of his body. He was the abandoned casualty this ambulance was meant to save, yet it was 50 years too late, and he was the only witness. The match flame sputtered violently, then died, plunging him back into suffocating darkness. Elias did not move. He remained hunched over the open box, the scent of the chemicals and aged cloth filling his nostrils. The sheer depth of the contents was overwhelming. The ambulance had been sealed in a moment of readiness, its purpose frozen in time. He had to calm himself. The panic was consuming energy he did not possess. He took slow, deliberate breaths, forcing the air deep into his starved lungs, trying to anchor himself in the physical reality of the metal box surrounding him. The medkit was not a source of magical food or spontaneous heat, but it was a treasure trove of utility. He needed to examine it systematically, not emotionally. He pulled the remaining matches out and arranged them carefully on the floor beside him, reserving only one for the next essential action. He needed a sustainable light source, and he knew he had seen one in the kit's inventory. He struck the last match. The flame flared. He leaned in again, searching the deeper recesses of the box, pushing aside the rolls of gauze. His finger brushed against glass. He lifted a small, thick-walled glass jar, sealed with a metal cap. Inside, packed in cotton wool, were several thick, slightly yellowed candle stubs, emergency illumination. Beside it lay a small metal tin of waterproof matches. Relief, sharp and potent, washed over him, momentarily displacing the seismic fear. He lit one of the small candle stubs. The light was weak, yellow and smoky, but persistent. It cast long, wavering shadows across the confined space, humanizing the interior of the ambulance, making it less of a tomb and more of a temporary shelter. Elias set the candle carefully onto the wooden shelf beside the open medical kit. The shaking slowly began to recede, replaced by a profound, cold fatigue. With the stable light, he began the systematic inventory of the trauma kit. He needed warmth and cleanliness. The gauze was useless for warmth, but the purity of the material was intoxicating. He took a single flat packet of the surgical cotton, handling it with extreme reverence. He carefully tore the brittle paper and plastic. The cotton unfurled, pristine and soft. He used the cotton to wipe the worst of the grime from his cheeks and forehead, the sensation of the clean material against his skin triggering a second, quieter wave of emotion. Not panic, but painful gratitude. He then turned his attention to the largest section of the kit. Beneath the surgical supplies, packed tightly, were several brown glass bottles. They contained various solutions. One, thick and reddish-brown, was labeled tincture of iodine, a potent, historical antiseptic. Elias carefully unscrewed the metal cap. The chemical odor was overwhelming, acrid and medicinal. He looked down at the deepest cut on his forearm, a jagged line from climbing a rusted fence days ago, now swollen and throbbing. The iodine represented pain. A sharp, burning, purifying pain. He hesitated for a long moment, the fear of the anticipated sting, battling with the inherent need to stop the slow, insidious infection. He needed to be whole. He needed to survive. He carefully uncorked the bottle and tipped a small, controlled amount onto the wound. The shock was immediate and paralyzing. A blinding, fiery heat erupted on his skin, so intense it made him cry out, a strangled, whimpering sound that was quickly absorbed by the thick walls of the buried vehicle. He clamped his jaw shut, fighting the urge to flinch away, watching through tear-filled eyes as the deep brown liquid seeped into the cut, dissolving the superficial filth. The burning sensation seemed to last an eternity, a harsh, brutal cleansing. When the agonizing intensity finally began to subside, he was sweating, shivering slightly. But there was a strange, grim satisfaction. He had faced the pain and utilized the resource. The purity of the medical intention, however painful, was now applied directly to his raw reality. He then took a roll of the compressed gauze. The wrapping was meticulous. He had to use the small, sharp scalpel from the kit, handling the cold steel blade with extreme caution, to slit the binding string. The gauze expanded immediately, a wide swath of tightly woven white cotton. He wrapped his forearm tightly, sealing the iodine and the wound away from the ambient grime. The act of wrapping the bandage was profoundly stabilizing. It was a physical performance of care, a gesture that had been absent from his life for too long. The white cotton was a silent promise of attention. He continued his search. He knew that military ambulances, especially those designed for prolonged deployment, often carried emergency rations, often dried biscuits or hard candy, meant for stabilizing blood sugar in severe trauma cases. He found them tucked away in the very bottom layer, beneath a large canvas-wrapped tourniquet. It was a thin metal tin, perfectly sealed. He pried the lid open using the same technique as the Medkit. Inside, protected by a waxy paper, were 4 thick, dense squares of what appeared to be military-issue hardtack biscuits. They were chalky white, flavorless, and perhaps hard enough to break a tooth, but they were calories, concentrated fuel. Elias did not devour them. The habit of rationing was too deeply ingrained. He broke off a tiny corner, placing the dry piece onto his tongue. It absorbed the moisture instantly, crumbling into a fine, dusty grit that tasted faintly of wheat and minerals. He chewed slowly, deliberately, savoring the meager substance as it slid down his throat. The first true sustenance in nearly 2 days. As the biscuit residue settled in his stomach, the intensity of his physical distress softened. The shaking, the product of cold fear and profound hunger, finally ceased. He was left with a heavy weariness, a deep, pervasive emotional drain. He looked around the ambulance cabin, now softly illuminated by the single flickering candle. It was small, barely long enough for the 2 stretchers it was designed to carry. The air remained stale but dry. He needed to prepare for the night. The stretcher upon which he had landed was secured by thick leather straps. He carefully released the straps and unfolded the heavy canvas structure. It revealed a thick, quilted padding underneath, a mattress of sorts. It smelled strongly of dust and age, but it was far softer and warmer than the freezing earth. He needed a blanket. He searched the overhead compartments with the candle held high. Most were empty, save for a few brittle, yellowed papers detailing inventory checks from decades ago. But in the farthest recess of the cab, tucked beneath a metal grate, he found it. It was a military-issue wool blanket, thick and heavy, the color of dried blood. It was folded with institutional precision. The edges were moth-eaten in a few places, but the majority of the weave was intact. He pulled it down. The weight was instantly comforting. He unfolded the rough wool, letting the distinct dusty odor of aged lanolin fill the air. Elias spread the blanket over the padded stretcher. He sat down, testing the softness. It was luxury. Absolute, unlooked-for luxury. He spent the next hour organizing his small, temporary sanctuary. He arranged the medkit next to him, the contents now a source of comfort, not dread. The precision of the tools no longer spoke of terrifying vulnerability, but of functional hope. The knowledge that he possessed the means to clean a wound, to treat an injury, was a massive psychological shield. He extinguished the candle, careful to save the remaining stub. The darkness returned, heavy and complete, but it was a different darkness now, a controlled, enclosed darkness, protected by thick metal and the earth itself. He slid beneath the thick wool blanket, pulling the coarse fabric up to his chin. The cold air rushed off the material, replaced by a gradually accumulating warmth generated by his own body heat. He lay there utterly still, listening to the intense silence. He felt the minute shift of the earth outside, perhaps the rustling of a nocturnal animal, muffled and remote. He was isolated, buried, and for the first time in months, profoundly safe. The trauma of the day began to surface, not as panic, but as a slow, corrosive sadness. He thought of his mother, the finality of her silence, the cold, stark reality of her leaving him behind. He thought of the constant, aching fear that had driven him for weeks, the fear of being seen, the fear of being caught, the terror of starvation and exposure. He pressed his face into the rough wool of the blanket. The scent was old, historical, perhaps carrying the residue of a soldier's pain or the frantic breath of a medic. He was lying in a historical conveyance of suffering, now transformed into his personal refuge. A profound, exhausted shudder ran through him, the last tremor of the day's emotional earthquake. It was not the violent, shaking fear of the Medkit discovery, but a deep, sorrowful recognition of his own fragility. He was 14, abandoned, hiding in a buried ambulance from a war that ended before his grandparents were born, relying on preserved emergency supplies to survive a quiet, invisible battle against the elements. He reached out in the darkness, his fingers brushing the smooth, cold surface of the wooden medical box. He didn't need the morphine. He needed the sanctuary, the structure, the precise organization of the world contained within that kit. It represented control in a life that had become entirely chaotic. Sleep came slowly, creeping in like the mist, a heavy, merciful blanket drawn over his consciousness. It was deep, untroubled sleep, the kind afforded by absolute exhaustion and the sudden, profound knowledge of being hidden and warm. When Elias woke, the air was bitterly cold, but the light was filtering weakly through the cracks in the sealed bodywork, painting thin, yellow-grey lines across the interior paneling. He felt stiff, his muscles aching from the cramped space and the previous day's exertion, but the deep, bone-gnawing chill of continuous exposure was gone. He was alive. He sat up, the wool blanket falling away. He reached for the candle stub and the waterproof matches, and soon the cabin was filled with the smoky, reassuring light. Survival required maintenance and ritual. He used the iodine again, methodically cleaning his minor cuts and scrapes. The pain was still intense but less shocking this time, a necessary consequence of survival. He ate 1/4 of a hardtack biscuit, sipping the few drops of moisture he could condense from the inside metal walls. He needed water and a way to signal if necessary, though the latter was terrifying. The metal container he had opened to find the biscuits was sturdy. He utilized the scalpel to carefully chip away at the earth around the vehicle's entry panel, enlarging the hole slightly, just enough to pass a small item through. He then took the metal tin, which was about the size of a man's hand, and tied it securely to the length of strong, braided twine he had found coiled inside the medkit. He pushed the tin through the opening, intending to collect rainwater or morning dew from a puddle outside. He spent the day in a state of suspended animation, moving only when absolutely necessary, conserving every calorie. He studied the ambulance in detail. He found, tucked into a deep crevice under the driver's seat, a small, heavily oiled leather pouch. Inside were several old oxidized copper coins, clearly not current currency, but perhaps enough metal to trade or melt down if necessary. And crucially, a heavy-duty, multi-tool knife, its blade folded neatly into the worn wooden handle. It was stiff, but functional. The knife was the ultimate prize. It replaced his clumsy ceramic shard and rebar lever. It was precision. Elias spent the afternoon carefully cleaning the knife, using the remnants of an oily rag he found near the engine partition. He sharpened the edge against a small, smooth piece of river stone he had carried for luck. The act of sharpening was meditative, a focus on a manageable task. As evening approached, he decided he needed to venture out briefly. He needed to find more water sources, perhaps scavenge more permanent fuel for the candle. The isolation of the ambulance was perfect for shelter, but terrible for resource acquisition. He waited until the deepest part of twilight, when the oppressive grey outside turned to deep, bruised blue. He put the metal tin back on its string, securing the knife and the remaining matches inside his jacket. He pushed the access panel open. The cold air rushed in, potent and sharp, contrasting violently with the stale warmth of the cabin. He carefully extracted himself, maneuvering his lean body through the narrow gap. He landed silently on the muddy ground outside, immediately pulling the panel shut behind him, sealing his secret refuge. The change in light and perspective was jarring. He was standing in the exact same spot where he had dug furiously the day before, but the landscape now looked infinitely larger, colder, and more hostile. He moved low, keeping close to the ground, using the broken concrete slabs as cover. He spotted a shallow puddle where the rain had collected near a large pile of rubble. Using the metal tin, he carefully scooped up the silty water, knowing he would have to filter it later through the thin gauze, a technique he had learned from a survival guide he had once seen in a library window. As he returned, hugging the shadow of the dilapidated railcar, he felt the intense scrutiny of the exposed landscape. Every sound, the whistle of the wind through the broken rail fences, the distant drone of highway traffic, felt like a potential alarm. He reached the ambulance, slipped the tin and the twine back through the opening, then slid his body back inside. The moment the panel clicked shut, the profound sense of relief washed over him again. He filtered the water laboriously, using a piece of sterile gauze as a strainer. The water remained silty, but cleaner than before. He consumed only a small, necessary amount. He looked at the open medkit. He felt no residual terror, only respect. The sterile white packages, the cold steel, the potent chemicals, they were the instruments of his continued tenuous life. He carefully re-examined the array of surgical tools. He took a pair of long, curved forceps. They were designed for delicate procedures, but he found an immediate utility. reaching items in the dark crevices of the ambulance without having to move his entire body. They were an extension of his arms. He noticed a small item he had overlooked the day before, lodged beneath the sutures. It was a dog tag, military issue, tarnished brass, hanging from a rusted length of chain. He held the tag up to the candlelight, rubbing the grit away with his thumb. The stamping was faint but legible. PFC, H.R. Denton, O.P.O.S., Cath. A name, a specific person. This ambulance, this metal tomb, was not just a collection of supplies. It was the last known location of a specific history. PFC Denton, whoever he was, had been associated with this vehicle. Perhaps he was the medic or the last casualty transported. The object gave the ambulance a soul, a past trauma that transcended Elias's own present pain. He was not alone in this space. He was sharing it with a ghost of history, a silent testament to suffering and duty. He placed the dog tag carefully on the shelf beside the candle. It was an offering, a recognition of the history that now sheltered him. Over the next few days, Elias established a rigorous, sustainable routine inside the buried ambulance. He would wake, consume a tiny portion of water and biscuit, perform minor maintenance on his body, and then spend the daylight hours searching for usable debris nearby, small pieces of wood, hard plastic, anything that could serve as fuel or a makeshift tool. The ambulance was his fortress, his quiet, secret anchor in a chaotic world. The resources were finite, however. The biscuits were dwindling, the candle wax was low. He knew he could not remain completely static. He had to think beyond immediate survival. The most potent resource remaining in the medkit was the chemical. The iodine was nearly gone, but he found a large, opaque bottle labeled isopropyl alcohol. Highly volatile, highly potent. Not for internal use, but an excellent fuel source if used carefully. He needed to create a tiny, controlled heat source, not for warmth, but for boiling water, a necessity if he was to scavenge water from potentially contaminated puddles. Using the metal tin, the curved forceps, and a piece of wire he stripped from a piece of old electrical conduit, he engineered a rudimentary miniature stove. He filled the bottom of the tin with a tiny amount of the alcohol. Set the tin on a bed of dry gravel he scraped from the ambulance floor and ignited the liquid with a match. The blue, nearly invisible flame was intense. It burned quickly, but efficiently. He balanced a second, smaller piece of metal, a lid from an old oil can, over the flame, and added a carefully measured teaspoon of his filtered water. The water took several minutes to heat, but eventually small, reassuring bubbles began to appear. He watched the process with intense, focused satisfaction. He was utilizing the elements of war to fight a civilian battle. The sterile precision of the medkit had taught him how to create structure and utility from desperation. When the water was boiled, he let it cool slightly, then drank it slowly. It was the purest water he had consumed in weeks, and the effect was immediate, a profound sense of revitalization. On the 5th day of his refuge, the weather outside turned dramatically worse. A freezing rain began to fall, turning the scar into a slick, muddy, dangerous quagmire. Elias was profoundly grateful for the thick metal roof over his head. He sat on the stretcher, wrapped entirely in the wool blanket, listening to the drumming rain on the metal skin above him, a sound that amplified the sense of his hidden security. He was running his finger along the grooves of PFC Denton's dog tag, contemplating his next move. He had gathered enough fuel and water to survive for perhaps another week in total isolation. But he needed proper food and clothing. He could not stay buried forever. He took out the multi-tool knife. It was time to use the sharpest tool in the box, the razor-thin scalpel blade still protected in its wrapping in the medkit, for the most difficult task. He needed to improve his armor. His threadbare jacket offered no real defense against the true cold. He looked at the thick wool blanket. Sacrificing the blanket for clothing was a terrifying prospect, as it was his only true source of warmth. but a small, heavy piece of wool stitched securely to his jacket would vastly improve his chances outside. He spent hours meticulously cutting a large rectangular patch from the very edge of the blanket, a place where the existing moth damage was most prevalent. The cut was clean, precise, made with the surgical scalpel. He used the coarse, braided twine from the Medkit as heavy-duty thread, pushing the needle, also retrieved from the surgical supplies, a large curved one used for stitching serious lacerations, through the thick fabric of his jacket and the dense wool patch. The sewing was clumsy, his fingers unused to such fine manipulation, but he was driven by necessity. By the time he was finished, the jacket had a heavy, double layer of wool across the chest and back, the most critical areas for heat retention. The final piece of his emotional and physical recovery came from the most unexpected place in the Medkit, a small, tightly sealed tin container marked "Personal Effects. Doctor." He pried the lid open. Inside, nestled beneath a layer of cotton, was a worn black-and-white photograph. It showed a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, smiling broadly, wearing a simple high-collared dress common to the 1940s. On the back, written in elegant looping script, were the words, "For Henry. Come home safe. May 1944. It was a window into the human reality of this ambulance. Henry, perhaps the doctor or the driver, had carried this hope into the theatre of war. The photograph was a symbol of enduring connection, of waiting, of a life that mattered. Elias held the photo, the image of the hopeful woman a shocking contrast to his own desolate, abandoned existence. He felt the intense wave of empathy, not for PFC Denton, the stranger, but for the universal human need for connection and return. The shaking did not return, but something deeper settled within him. The overwhelming sense of isolation, which had been his constant companion, eased slightly. He realized that this ambulance, this forgotten metal vessel, had not abandoned its purpose. It had held fast to the hope of healing and the memory of a past life. He was ready. He had cleaned his wounds, fortified his shelter, and repaired his clothing. He had internalized the silent lesson of the Medkit. Survival requires precision, organization, and the application of resources, however sparse. He looked at the tiny remaining crust of the hardtack biscuit. He decided to save it. He would face the outside world on an empty stomach, but with a clean wound, a reinforced jacket, a sharp knife, and the knowledge of his safe, secret place waiting for his return. He gathered his few possessions, the multi-tool knife, the last of the waterproof matches, the photograph of the woman, a talisman of hope, and PFC Denton's dog tag, a symbol of silent companionship. As the sun began to set, painting the crack in the roof a final fading orange, Elias moved to the exit panel. He pushed the heavy latch, the rusty grown familiar now, almost welcoming. He looked back one last time at the candle, guttering low on the shelf beside the open medkit. He felt a profound sense of gratitude to the unknown soldiers, doctors, and logistics officers who had packed this box with such meticulous care, preserving the tools that had ultimately saved him, not just physically, but by giving him a structure to cling to in his despair. He squeezed out into the cold twilight, pulling the panel securely shut behind him, burying his sanctuary once more. He rose to his feet, feeling the rough, heavy weight of the stitched wool against his chest. He was thin, still desperately hungry, but he was standing tall. He had found his footing in a place designed for collapse, and he carried the sterile, unwavering purpose of the war ambulance's medical kit within him, a terrifying, life-giving clarity that had driven out the debilitating, paralyzing fear of his abandonment. He moved away from the buried vehicle, not wandering aimlessly, but walking with a focused, deliberate step towards the distant low light of the nearby town, prepared to face the cold world, armed not with weapons, but with gauze, iodine, and the hard-won resilience of a soul that had stared into the heart of historical trauma and found a path back to survival.